Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another Proline season. I'm Scott Spreitzer here with Glenn McGrew. Jim Feist and Dave Koken are out for this week, but I tell you what, folks, we're going to talk about some interesting preseason football angles on this show. And want to remind everybody that we're going to be here each and every week throughout preseason football. We'll even maybe dive into some college predictions at the end of August. And, of course, next month, about a month from now, we'll be back on TV on the USA Network and on Spike TV. Details on that coming up at the end of August also. But today, we're focused on preseason football. We got a couple of games we're going to talk about that Glenn and I have dissected a little bit. But before we get into that, one of the key factors, obviously, when it comes to handicapping and betting on preseason football as opposed to regular season football are some of the key differences that coaches make for preseason preparation. Some coaches like to play to win. Glenn, I remember a couple of years ago when Steve Spurrier was in his first season as the head coach of the Washington Redskins. In May, 3 months before preseason began, I read this article on the newspaper back east in Washington talking about how he said, if they keep score, I play to win. Well, I wrote that down. He happened to be going up against Steve Mariucci in his very first game for Spurrier. And I said, wow, Mariucci, he doesn't care too much about preseason football his last couple of years. It was Washington against San Francisco. The Redskins blew them out in week 1, and I don't think Steve Spurrier ever won another game. But anyway, the bottom line is there are certain factors you can look for when it comes to handicapping preseason football that you just don't come across in regular season action.
Well, Scott's right. You know, it's interesting. Every year I hear the same thing from a lot of my friends. I said, well, wait a minute, Glenn. This stuff doesn't count. They're not keeping score here. It doesn't matter if the Minnesota Vikings open up by losing 4 exhibition games, preseason games, because the regular season starts and then they start counting. But I tell you, that's a mistake a lot of handicappers make, Scott. You don't realize that in preseason, sometimes there's more information out there about how the game's going to unfold than there is during the regular season when the coaches want to keep things tight a little bit. You talk about quarterback rotation. That everybody hears about that, but it's a key factor. And when you think about quarterback rotation, folks, think about this. You don't just pick a team that has a great quarterback. The New England Patriots. You think that Tom Brady is going to play very much in this ball game, in this first preseason game, or the second one? No, probably 1 series, maybe 2. What you have to look at is the second, third, and even 4th-string quarterbacks. Those are the guys that are going to get the most minutes in the contest. And you don't have to find guys that are going to lead you to a Super Bowl. If you have a 2nd and 3rd-string quarterback that's been in the league a long time, 4, 5, 6 years, he's not a great quarterback, but he understands the offense. He knows the personnel, or most of them anyway. You're going to find that these guys are going to have more success when you play out the game. Also look for quarterbacks that have a lot of scrambling ability. Let's face it, the defenses, especially in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th quarters, you're going to have a lot of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th-string guys out there. They're not going to be able to cover receivers like they normally do. So if you have a quarterback that can scramble an awful lot, bide you some time, then he's going to find some wide-open receivers. He might not be a great quarterback, but since he's got this scrambling ability, he can make time and get a chance to throw down to the receiver. So that's one of the key things to look at. It isn't, when you look at rotation, don't just look at your top quarterbacks. Look at the depth of the team. Look who they have as a 2nd and 3rd-string quarterback.
There's some great preseason football quarterbacks out there.
Oh, there are, aren't there?
Leo Lemon. There's a great preseason quarterback that comes to mind. I also like to throw into what you're talking about when it comes to quarterback rotations. To me, that's the first thing I look for. Then I move on to coaches, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I like it when you've got like a 2nd and 3rd stringer who are battling it out for that 2nd spot. When there's a serious battle going on in preseason football, you're going to get some great advantages when that team goes up against an opponent who has already decided on who their top 3 quarterbacks are going to be, and you really get some nice advantages there. Pittsburgh and New Orleans just played this past weekend, and shameless plug, we had the Steelers, and we jumped out right away as our preseason game of the month, and that was one of the key factors that we look for each and every year. First week of the preseason, you had a Pittsburgh Steelers organization that is a very proud one that's not used to watching the playoffs on TV, which is exactly what they did last year. We had another key factor jump in there. We have a brand new coach taking over for the Pittsburgh Steelers who wanted to get back into that winning mode right off the bat. And then we had a New Orleans Saints team who came in having played late in January because they made the postseason. When you get all those wrapped up into one, you've got a pretty nice advantage when it comes to the team that I just mentioned, the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I suggest that people look for that also. Teams that maybe were on the cusp of making the playoffs or had an embarrassing year last year. And now they come into this preseason in their first game. They kind of want to set a new tone. They want to get their fans interested. And if they've got a new coach to boot along the way, you're going to see a pretty good effort from that squad in their first game or two of preseason action.
It's interesting you mentioned that because your number 2 quarterback for the Steelers, Charlie Batch. Now, list the top 15 quarterbacks in the NFL. You might go to top 20 quarterbacks. Charlie Batch isn't going to be on the list. I mean, let's face it. He had a chance to lead the Detroit Lions to a lot of wins and didn't manage to do that. But here's a guy who you don't mind having the ball for you with second teamers or third teamers in there, and that's the advantage they have. But where you mentioned too about the coaches, that's interesting because not only are there coaches you mentioned earlier that really stress the regular season, the preseason, as opposed to guys who are just trying to build their squad. Again, when they're new like that, the first thing a Pittsburgh coach like this guy wants to do is he wants to get off to a winning start, especially take a look at the schedule. Maybe Pittsburgh, be honest with you, I'm not sure this time, but if Pittsburgh plays an opening game at home, then say 2 on the road, and then their final preseason's at home again, if you know they're going to play on the road the next couple of weeks, and it's maybe even a stronger play for the home team in that first.
The bottom line is change from week to week, and we will. You'll see the show each and every week throughout the preseason because you do change your philosophies from week 1 to week 2 and so on in preseason football. Some coaches will stress certain weeks more than others, and of course, week 3 is basically the general consensus is that's the dress rehearsal for the regular season. So you get a lot of starters going 3 quarters against each other. But other things that I've noticed over the last couple of years is the total. I mean, the under has really been the play in preseason football over the past few years. Head coaches looking to avoid injuries to key players, whether it be first string or second string, all of a sudden are just looking to run that clock. They might, let's say, give you 10 to 15 plays from their starters to start a game in the first couple of weeks of the preseason. They switch to the backups. Let's say if they've got a second and third string quarterback battle going on, that might last through the first half, maybe part of the third quarter. And then it's really coming down to let's run out the clock and make sure we don't get any key injuries. And so you've seen the totals on these games really starting to go under over the past few years. But I'm telling you what, folks, and looking at this first couple of weeks of preseason football and seeing the lines that are out there, the odds maker has adjusted. So don't get caught into this Johnny-come-lately, I'm going to jump on the public bandwagon, everybody's playing unders. There's a game we're going to talk about, by the way, in a little bit that I'm going to talk about how the total was adjusted way too much for what's been going on in the last few years. So pay attention to those things and don't get caught. Don't come along too late and say, okay, well, I'm going to jump on unders because that's the way it's been going the last few years because the odds maker, you know how they do it. They make their money off of the public, and they're going to make those adjustments sometimes too much.
It's funny you said that because it almost looks like the handicappers had an easy job the last couple of years. They work real hard on coming up with a good number on the side of the game, and then like automatically 3-7, 37. You see more 37s in preseason. But making a stronger point about what you mentioned too, teams. Look for teams, too, that are going to play early in the regular season. If they have a matchup in the preseason, let's face it, these coaches don't want to give away a game plan. They're not going to take some of their wrinkles or offensive things, ideas that they have once the regular season starts. They're not going to use those. They're just going to play very vanilla, and that's going to lead to unders more often than not.
And if you could be in a joint that has second half plays in preseason football, really look at the unders there the first couple of weeks especially. That's where we've made a lot of money, playing the under in the second half of a football game. Well, our second quarter begins in just a few minutes. We're going to talk about the Rams and the Vikings up next. You're watching Proline.
Up next, the St. Louis Rams travel to take on the Minnesota Vikings in one of Friday's football games. But first, we'll hear from Glenn McGrew of Primetime Sports as he looks to kick off another profitable football season.